so nice for everyone seeing all of you here. And we're going to be discussing a really important topic, so I'm super glad you're here. Probably like some of you, I've worked with plants my whole life. I've planted trees on the Christmas tree farms where I worked, and I planted the crops for farmers market, and wherever I lived, I planted what I thought were wildlife oases. That is until I read Doug Tallamy's first book. Have any of you read Doug Tallamy's books? Are you familiar with him? I highly recommend them. They're a must-read to learn why it's so urgent that we support biodiversity. I learned that most of the plants I grew were introduced species, and worse yet, many were invasive plants. So I began spending all my time in removing invasive plants and sowing seed, planting native plants, and chasing off deer. And one Saturday afternoon, I looked around at my neighbors' huge lawns, and I listened to their noisy lawnmowers, and it all felt so hopeless. And I knew that the Tallamys lived somewhere in southeastern Pennsylvania, which is where I live. And I suddenly had this idea, why don't we just move near the Tallamys? So the next week I was weeding Creeping Charlie out from underneath my persimmon trees, and I came across this scrap of paper, and it was a corner of an envelope with a return address label, the Tallamy family. So it turned out that the Tallamys live just 2 properties over. So now there was no way I could introduce myself, just walk down their driveway and introduce myself, because I come from a fruit growing background. And a list of the fruit species that I used to grow reads like a list of perpetrators in an invasive plant crime novel. Clearly, I couldn't introduce myself to the Tallamys of all people until I'd removed all these invasive plants that I had planted. So several years passed by. And one summer day, I was once again feeling overwhelmed and pretty defeated. So I mailed a letter to Dr. Tallamy and I said, I love your books, but it would be so helpful if there were a step-by-step guide to go along with them. And in so many words, he replied, great idea, write it. And that's how I came to spend 4 years of my life neglecting my gardens and writing Nature's Action Guide. The guide takes an environmentally friendly, cost-conscious, and toward zero waste approach. And the goal of the book is to help people of all demographics, whether they're gardeners or not, to help support biodiversity. And it features the 15 urgently needed actions shown here. Just a sec. And these actions are listed in the handout, which you can find at naturesactionguide.org/biodiversity. And almost all the references and links that I'll mention are also listed in the handout. So I'll post this link again at the end of my talk. So you can probably guess the answer to this question. What action can we take that helps to restore biodiversity and incidentally also helps address climate change? We can build wildlife habitat. It's not often that good news and climate change appear in the same sentence, but I think it's really good news that it turns out that our efforts to support biodiversity also help with mitigation and adaptation to climate change. An ecological landscape is different from traditional U.S. landscapes by its focus on providing wildlife habitat. A resilient wildlife habitat must offer food, water, cover, and nesting. A really positive thing about this is that we can build wildlife habitat at where we live in whatever spaces we have. And this evening, we'll explore some strategies for doing this. When it comes to supporting biodiversity, the topic of protection is of prime importance because the hazards to wildlife from our homes and in our landscapes are such that proactively protecting our local wildlife may well do as much to support biodiversity as the wildlife habitat we create. In the face of biodiversity loss and climate change, perhaps the most important animal populations that need our protection are insects and other invertebrates. If you ever doubt that your efforts to build wildlife habitat are urgently needed, read this article. It describes the experience of Daniel Jensen. He's an ecologist who, one night in 1978, in the middle of a dense Costa Rican forest, he took a photograph of moths in which approximately 3,000 species of moths were identified, all different sizes, shapes, and colors. Not 3,000 individual moths, but 3,000 species. Now, he hangs a sheet in the same setting, but just a few moths flutter to the light. Most sobering of all, this observation took place in a pristine landscape largely uninhabited by humans. Despite the shocking insect declines worldwide, we live in a twisted reality in which most of our society is engaged in a war on insects. What can each of us do to protect insect populations? There's easy things we need to do, like using non-toxic pest control methods and choosing plants that support insects, and changing how we light our spaces. We need to care for our landscapes without resorting to toxic chemicals. For example, neonicotinoids, neonics for short, are a group of systemic insecticides that work by moving through the plant's entire structure, contaminating every part of the plant, including the pollen. They're intended to kill insects, and they do that really well. Fortunately, most native plant suppliers have moved away from neonics, giving us yet another big incentive to buy native plants and choose native plants and grow them. Unfortunately, neonics are still widely used in the production of annuals, mums, hanging baskets, poinsettias, foliage woodies, and in turf and agricultural crops. To cover all the various toxic pesticides and fertilizers, when purchasing plants and seed, ask for USDA certified organic plants and seed. Since it can cost over $2,000 to become certified, a small native plant nursery likely won't be certified, but you can ask them and they'll surely tell you if they do use organic procedures, and your voice will be added to the growing demand for pesticide-free native plants. When nursery industry professionals recently were asked what factors most influenced their decision to carry native species, customer demand was the top factor. Your voice does matter. Pesticides really aren't needed in our home landscapes. For alternative pest management methods, visit beyondpesticides.org. At home and in our communities, we have lots of opportunities to encourage and protect insects and other nocturnal wildlife. The rich ecology of nocturnal wildlife depends on true darkness. Artificial light at night even negatively impacts plants, affecting their growth, flowering, dormancy, and plant-insect interactions such as pollination. Moths are fatally attracted to artificial light at night. Given the importance of caterpillars in the food web, this is a big concern. Fortunately, this is a problem we all can help to solve by changing our essential outdoor lighting to amber or yellow LED bulbs. Unfortunately, amber or yellow lights don't protect migratory birds, or other birds as well, but migratory birds in particular are especially vulnerable to artificial light at night. Birds become disoriented and strike glass, or they fly around all night until they finally land exhausted. At this point, they're vulnerable to other hazards, so lights off is best to protect birds. Unfortunately, changing to yellow and amber lights doesn't help fireflies. Blue, yellow, and amber lights in particular interfere with the flashing signals that fireflies use to attract mates. When artificial light is present, even when it's dim or a distance away, female fireflies rarely mate or don't mate at all. Switching to red lights, or better yet, turning out the lights completely, protects some bat species, since artificial light at night interferes with their roosting, foraging, and flight patterns. It might seem that bats could forage more efficiently around lights, but some bat species may starve to death, not leaving their roosts as they wait for the darkness of night that never comes. Turning out lights is Best of all, but where outdoor light's absolutely necessary, light fixtures should include dusk-to-dawn motion sensors and timers and shields to direct the light downward where it's needed and nowhere else. You can visit Dark Sky, Maryland to learn how to protect the night skies around here. Protecting the night skies is the perfect first step towards supporting biodiversity because it can be as easy as turning out the lights or adding light blocking curtains. With a few changes in our habits and minimal expense, we can create unofficial dark sky parks of our own. One of the most deadly ecological traps are the glass windows in our homes and throughout our communities. Early in the morning, before street cleaners make their morning pass, volunteers walk downtown city streets to pick up and record glass strike victims, like this tragic collection. You've likely heard that sickening thump on a window at your house. In the US alone, it's estimated that well over 1 million birds strike glass per day at our home windows. After striking glass, birds may fly off, but the majority die later from internal injuries, broken bones, predation, and other dangers. We can help to prevent this tragedy by applying stickers or painting designs on the outside of our windows. I've included this stencil for making these leaf stickers and a grid for painting dots in the handout. Remember the 2x2 rule. Gaps larger than 2 inches and single stickers simply don't offer protection. And markings must be placed on the outside of the windows. It's the reflections that cause the problem. And right now, you're probably thinking that this makes it horrible to look out the window, but it really doesn't. You barely notice the markings. If you live in a fancy neighborhood, consider purchasing products such as these evenly spaced dots supplied from a roll of tape or film. You can visit the American Bird Conservancy website for a database of glass strike prevention products and solutions. We also must protect our wildlife habitat from our beloved cats. It's hard to get our heads around the fact that our pet cats kill between 1 to 2.7 million birds per day across the US. Stray cats, such as barn cats, kill an estimated 3.6 million birds per day. We can still have cats. We just need to create interesting indoor worlds for them and care for them in a wildlife-friendly way. The SPCA offers free plans for building catios, including DIY, window catios, porch catios, standalone catios with tunnel access, and catio enrichment plans. In addition to protecting the wildlife we attract, sometimes we need to protect our plants from wildlife. Along with habitat loss, in many regions, deer are a leading cause in the decline of biodiversity. A fence is the best defense against deer and rabbits, but not just any fence will do. In the handout, I've included these 2 pages from Nature's Action Guide with a DIY how-to for installing deer and rabbit exclosures, but fences aren't acceptable in many neighborhoods. You may have to settle for individual wire cages around young trees and shrubs. I find this motion-activated sprinkler to be effective, but it does require batteries, a water source, and upkeep. Spraying homemade or commercial deer repellents can work, but they have to be consistently reapplied. Recently, I've been hearing about Trico. It's a deer deterrent used in forest restoration that sounds quite promising. Its active ingredient is sheep fat, and it's effective. It lasts, a single application is reported to last 6 months, and it's pricey at $115 per gallon, but I think it's worth keeping an eye out for increased availability in the US. No plant is deer-proof, but aside from deer-proof fencing, choosing deer-resistant plants is still the best bet. Rutgers Cooperative Extension offers a downloadable list of over 500 landscape plants, including many native plants, that are rated on deer resistance. Try out meadow expert Larry Wiener's recommendation to plant a deer favorite with a deer-resistant plant, even planting the plants in the same hole. And if deer are a problem for you, watch this video for a crash course in deer behavior, deterrence, and landscaping tips. With our protections in place, we're ready to find or make space for wildlife habitat. Aside from planting in containers or buying more land, there's three main ways of doing this. We can find space between existing plants in our landscape and make space by removing lawn or by removing eco-harmful invasive introduced plants. Typical U.S. landscapes with their mulched foundation beds make finding space between existing plants an easy place to start adding wildlife habitat. The X's shown here are places where low-growing native ground covers or perennials can be planted in a 12-inch grid between these existing plants. The only good thing that I can see about endless lawn is the endless potential for making space for wildlife habitat. As the largest irrigated crop in the U.S., lawns use nearly 1/3 of all residential waters to the tune of 9 billion gallons per day of drinkable water. To add insult to injury, mowing our lawns for 1 hour emits as much air pollution as driving a new passenger car from Tacoma Park to Pittsburgh. Using a commercial leaf blower for an hour, you might as well drive to San Antonio, Texas. Consider which areas of your lawn are logical places to start removing. I added this island bed to the middle of my front lawn to serve as a refuge for small creatures fleeing for safety during mowing as I work to transition my lawn to native plantings. These 3 trees were tedious to mow around, and now a single kidney bean-shaped bed makes it easy to mow. Replace poorly growing grass that looks crummy anyway with native plants, many of which thrive in poor soil, like this colorful display in its first year. Shrinking the lawn to create pupation sites not only is a win for caterpillars, but it's so much easier mowing under trees with low-hanging branches. Not having to mow under them, I should say. And once you've decided upon a location, follow these steps in the handout for shrinking that area of lawn. One of the most important actions we can take is to remove invasive plants. Invasive plants are introduced plants to an ecoregion that cause ecological damage, for example, by smothering native vegetation. Invasive plants themselves are not inherently bad. In fact, they likely play a beneficial role in an ecosystem somewhere else in the world. Lance-leaf coreopsis, a valuable deer-resistant pollinator plant native in many U.S. counties, is one of Japan's most harmful species. If you have stiltgrass in your yard, then you likely have firsthand experience with a difficult, eco-harmful, invasive plant. On the left is my front garden bed in the summer of 2023. There were a couple of stiltgrass plants which I removed. Otherwise, the bed was pretty clean, except for the pre-existing seed bank. In the summer of 2024, due to a serious injury, I couldn't get out in the garden. And here's the same spot run over with stiltgrass. This past August, I spent 20 mornings removing stiltgrass, and here's one morning's efforts. At the residential scale, we can control almost all the problematic plants we encounter in our homes and yards using non-toxic control methods. Your best defense against invasive plants is being able to identify them at different stages, especially as seedlings, and take them out as soon as you spot them. This book, co-authored by members of the Maryland Native Plant Society, is an outstanding resource for getting to know these plants before they take up residence in your landscape. Planning ahead prevents eco-harmful species from getting a foothold in the first place. These strategies are examples of how the best practices for caring for a wildlife habitat also address the impacts of climate change. For example, planting densely shades soil from high heat, and it protects soil structure from both heavy rainfall and evaporation during drought. If you come from a traditional gardening background, You might be surprised, as I was, that some of the weeds I was pulling were actually ecologically beneficial native plants, such as the ones shown here. I'm embarrassed to admit that it took me the longest time to realize this, but when I began using iNaturalist, using the to identify the weeds I was pulling, and then the BONAP maps to find out if they were friend or foe, there were a few real surprises. Carolina horse nettle leaves are always perforated with holes where insects have fed on them, and clearweed often shelters insects like this one. I'm not going to be pulling any more weeds without first doing a better job of confirming their identity. Let's take a quick look at how to use the Biota of North American program maps, known as the BONAP maps. They're an incredibly useful tool for determining if a plant that you've identified is a welcome native or, hopefully not, an introduced noxious plant. Let's evaluate a couple of honeysuckles. In your browser, you would search for BONAP county and the genus, in this case Lonicera, the genus for honeysuckle that we'll use as an example. And be sure to include the word county in your search terms because otherwise some less useful state maps may come up. The first result should show this page with many species of Lonicera. Scroll down until you find the individual map for Lonicera involucrata, and here the line green shows us that twinberry is native to many counties in the western U.S., but none at all in the east. Now scroll further down the maps until you find Lonicera japonica. Here, aqua blue shows us that Japanese honeysuckle is introduced in these counties. Bright pink indicates that it's found on a state or county noxious list. This is a honeysuckle that, unfortunately for probably most of us, we're familiar with this one. Definitely check out the BONAP maps. They're a favorite resource for ecological gardeners, amateurs and professionals alike. We've looked at finding and making space for wildlife habitat. Now let's look at some resources for choosing plants to boost wildlife and plant populations. Our plant choices offer a first line of defense for insects and other animals by providing nourishment, cover from predators, and safe places to reproduce. Small populations lack the resilience that large populations have when drought, extreme temperatures, or something else takes a heavy toll on a population. So we need to work on building up the populations now to give the populations as much time as possible to get strengthened so that they can withstand the challenges of the future. And why is it so important to choose native plants? Animals and plants evolve over time to find their ecological niche. Some plant species are generalists and can survive in a variety of conditions in contrast to specialists that require precise growing conditions. For example, the generalist black cherry is a fast-growing tree with a wide distribution from the East Coast to Arizona, in contrast to the pitcher plant that requires boggy, acidic soil, full sun, and high humidity, significantly limiting its distribution. When it comes to insects, generalists are those with a wide variety of food options or other adaptations, while specialists are uniquely adapted to one or just a few options. Insect specialization is why the vast majority of introduced plants, although really beautiful in our landscapes, fail to support the full range of diversity of our local wildlife. If it weren't for specialization, we wouldn't have to spend so much time removing invasive plants, and we could all continue planting the stunningly gorgeous introduced plants. But specialization does occur in nature. For example, although some caterpillars are generalists because they can feed on many different plant species, the majority are specialists. If the host plants for specialists aren't present, the specialists won't be present either. And that's why we need to choose native plants. For many birds, including most songbirds, caterpillars are the top item on the baby food menu. And given the importance of caterpillars in the food web, Doug Tallamy and his colleagues found that the number of Lepidoptera caterpillar species that feed on a plant is an ideal metric for identifying keystone plants. Like the keystone in an arch, a keystone species supports the ecosystem that it's part of. There are many examples of keystone species at all levels of the animal and plant kingdoms, from oaks and saguaro cactus to beavers and the American alligator. An ecosystem collapses without its keystone species. So we need to be planting keystone plants, shrubs, and trees. And here's some tools for choosing keystone plants. Pollinator Partnership offers this handy free guide to caterpillar host plants specific to this region. This guide features 5 caterpillar host plant relationships with a photo of the host plant at the top of each column, the caterpillar in the middle, and the adult Lepidoptera at the bottom. To dig in deeper, the National Wildlife Federation Native Plant Finder, a resource that Doug helped to create, is a very helpful tool for identifying more host plants for caterpillars. It's super easy to use. Click Set Location and enter your zip code. Click Find Native Plants to view the top keystone plants for your region. Learning which plants are keystone plants make planning for specialist caterpillars a lot easier. In this region, oak is the top keystone genus, hosting 500 moth and butterfly species. Planting keystone plants will meet the needs of hundreds of butterfly and moth species, but some caterpillars specialize on plants that are not keystone species. The monarch caterpillar, with its dependence on milkweed, makes milkweed a perfect example of a host plant that isn't a keystone plant, but that critically needs to be planted if we're to prevent the monarch butterfly from going extinct. You can find out the specific host plants for a specific butterfly or moth that you'd like to attract, and here's the easiest way I've found to do it on this site. You simply type in what you would like to search for. In this case, the example is Luna moth. The caterpillar of the Luna moth is considered a generalist, with 25 possible host plant genera for its caterpillars, including oak, cherry, and willow. An interesting aside, the adult Luna moth doesn't have any mouth parts or digestive organs, and they only live for about a week to reproduce. You can explore many different Lepidoptera profiles by clicking Find Butterflies. Simply explore the Lepidoptera profiles. The profiles are arranged by the specialists, the pickiest eaters, first. The first 4 Lepidoptera shown here for this area use only one genus as a host plant. You can then click on the plant genus profiles, and some of these show a list of the native species in your local ecoregion. Let's look at some resources for choosing plants for pollinators. From bats to bees to birds and moths, Pollinator Partnership offers some handy planting guides for selecting plants for pollinators. It describes this region's different pollinators and the plant traits they depend on. It also lists the native plants that attract pollinators in this region, along with lots of helpful information. For native bees, our plant choices really matter because 20 to 45% of them are pollen specialists. In the Mid-Atlantic, the top 4 genera for native pollen specialist bees, shown here, are all also keystone species for caterpillars. You may already be growing some of these. In addition to these top pollinator host plants, it's especially urgent that we provide plants that bridge the pollen gap. This occurs between early spring ephemerals blooming and the mid and late summer meadow plants that we just looked at. The most important genus for bridging the pollen gap is willow, along with blueberry and dogwood. Let's take it a step further with the help of horticulturalist and conservationist Jared Fowler and wildlife biologist Sam Droege. They provide us with a comprehensive list of U.S. native pollen specialist bee species and the plant genera they specialize on. You can find the nectar and pollen gathering time and pollen host plant genera for each native bee species, helping us to choose the plant's rare native pollen specialist bees need to survive. Scroll down on this webpage for a list of 60 underpropagated plants that are critical for vulnerable native pollen specialist bee populations. If you're an experienced gardener, you might want to be part of the urgently needed effort to propagate these plants. Although these are rarely available for purchase, you may actually have some of these plants volunteering in your garden, such as Philadelphia fleabane, or this charming tiny flower clasping Venus's looking glass. Whatever else we do, native bee expert Sam Droege urges us to plant flowers, which includes flowering shrubs and trees, in whatever spaces we can. He explains that it takes just 5 flowers to raise 1 baby bee. A large flower like a sunflower supplies enough pollen and nectar to feed 100 bee cells. Even just a container on a balcony filled with flowers could mean that a native bee survives. As we've already seen, nesting and water are 2 of the 4 essential elements of wildlife habitat. The plants we choose and the way we care for our landscape has a profound impact on the quality of nesting that our property offers. You've heard the rally cries, leave the leaves, save the stems. This is all about providing nesting. Native and especially keystone trees will attract caterpillars. Mowed or fabric mulched beds beneath them are an ecological trap. Caterpillars drop down from the tree to pupate, but either get mowed over or can't burrow into the soil. By leaving the leaves and filling the spaces beneath shrubs and trees with plants, we support moths and butterflies by creating caterpillar pupation sites or soft landings. For more about soft landings, visit pollinator expert Heather Holmes' website. We think that we can rake up the leaves and remove any pupae before shredding or bagging the leaves, but nature skillfully camouflages them. Have you noticed the 5 Luna moth pupae I added to this photo? I can barely see them, and I put them there. There's a popular myth that several days of 50-degree temperature means we can clean up the leaves and stems, but really, there's no good time to remove them because insects hatch or emerge from their nests at all different times. And here, in case you're curious, here are the Luna moth pupae. And they're still here. Most beds look tidy enough with a 2 to 3 inch layer of leaves left in place until they decompose. Dense plantings will help keep the leaves in place, but if your neighborhood doesn't permit this or if the leaves blow around, gather them and place them in out of view pile no deeper than 6 inches. And low wire fencing can help keep them in place. Insects need nesting places. Fortunately, planting a variety of native plants will provide pithy and hollow stem plants that offer nesting sites for cavity nesting insects, such as bees, beetles, and wasps. Resist the urge to tidy up in fall and early spring. Where tidying up is necessary, cut stems to varying heights, 8 to 24 inches. In a formal neighborhood, stems cut 8 to 12 inches do tend to look tidy enough. Find several places on your property where the ground can be left for ground nesting bees, and they don't sting. The Xerxes Society recommends sunny, well-drained, undisturbed patches of bare or sparsely vegetated soil, ideally on a gentle slope where bees can easily access the ground to dig their nests. We can attract beetles, another important group of pollinators, by providing moist leaf litter, researching and planting the host plants for different beetle species, and putting rocks and logs in our garden beds. But you probably don't want logs as big as the one I'm trying to figure out how to incorporate into my landscape. Although spiders aren't pollinators, they're essential predators and prey in the food web. Be sure to leave spider webs and plant densely in layers. This provides structural diversity for hiding spots, hunting perches, and anchor points for web building. Encourage the birds that visit your wildlife habitat to stay and nest. By providing the birds with nesting spots, dense shrubs, dead trees when safe for cavity nesting birds, and open branch trees for nesting for birds such as orioles and hummingbirds. We also need to provide ready access to food for birds. A pileated woodpecker in search of insects made short work of this log that I intentionally left in my garden bed. All those chips and shreds are done by the woodpecker. The National Audubon Society's native plant database is a very handy tool for bird lovers. Enter your zip code to generate and illustrate a list of plants native to your region that will attract and support different bird families. And then you can click on each plant profile, which leads to information about the different families of birds the plant may attract. Then you can click each bird profile to see its range, conservation status, and much more. Include water into your wildlife habitat design. Add as many water features for wildlife as you can reasonably take care of. Add heated sources to ensure a steady supply through the cold winter. And when possible, add larger water features. They take more effort to install, but they're well worth the effort, as you're likely to see some wildlife that you really will not see otherwise. With everything we've looked at so far, we've actually already covered some strategies for designing for nature. But let's look at some more ways we can design to support insects. Once you've observed a butterfly's preferred nectar plants and identified its caterpillar host plants, you can plant them nearby one another. Pollinators are more likely to visit flowers when there's at least a 3-foot by 3-foot mass of their preferred species. The masses of a single species are called drifts. At planting time, create attractive drifts by intermingling two species at the point where they meet. For example, group a mass of flowers next to a contrasting color of flowers and mix a few together where the two masses meet. Drifts help pollinators forage more efficiently, and they make a landscape visually appealing to people. Earlier, we looked at planting to bridge the pollen gap. For some insects, their active nectar and pollen gathering stage lasts just a couple of weeks. The flowers they specialize on need to be in bloom for these insects to survive. The Pollinator Partnership provides handy native pollinator garden recipe cards. These plants are a good starting point for ensuring a sequence of blooms. With the threat of weather events and a changing climate, we need to take planting a sequence of blooms one step further and build in functional redundancy. That's just a fancy way of saying we need to plant multiple species that bloom at the same time, ideally aiming for 3 blooming species at any given time during the growing season, such as these 3 spring bloomers. This way, even if some species bloom earlier than they used to or fail to bloom, a sequence of blooms still happens. Strategically place plants to help optimize insects' foraging efficiency. Planting masses of asters, for example, allows small native bees to forage efficiently within their limited range. Using an average foraging distance of 820 yards, the Pollinator Pathway Program strives to connect properties into a continuous pathway richly planted with the nectar and pollen plant that pollinators need. Their website offers a wealth of pollinator resources. Where possible, connect the plantings on your own lawn, own property. Here in my front yard are 3 young oak trees, and over time, the understory plants will fill in and connect these beds. Optimize your neighbor's plantings by situating your plantings near theirs. This begins to create habitat corridors, allowing animals to freely roam and reproduce with other subpopulations. We've figured out where we can add plants, and we've looked at some resources for choosing plants. we can use the plants already growing in our property to guide our plant placement. Think of a plant that's growing well for you. It can be a thriving introduced plant or a native plant that's doing well. For example, a thriving patch of dandelions tells me that beard tongue, black-eyed Susan, evening primrose, and goldenrod will do well. And places where one of these native species thrives would be good for the other native species shown here. Traditional gardening often focuses on perennials, yet trees and shrubs require far less care than perennial plantings or lawn. They can fill a space, making them an ideal choice if you're really busy or not inclined toward gardening. Trees and shrubs support high numbers of caterpillars, and they're an extremely valuable source of pollen and nectar. Plus, some bloom in early spring when not a lot else is blooming. As our climate becomes unstable, build resilience into your landscape. We can do this by choosing a variety of persistent plants that respond to environmental changes in different ways. The fancy term for this is response diversity. Include plants that are drought, flood, heat, or cold tolerant, fire, wind, or deer resistant, and so on, to give your landscape a better chance of weathering an unstable climate. We've covered some ways to design to attract nature. Now let's look at designing to attract people. How can we design our home landscapes for ecology and beauty? Unfortunately, we don't need to be expert landscape designers. We just need to get familiar with all the freely available resources and get to know our property really well. When envisioning an ecological planting, it's helpful to observe many landscapes so that you can start to get a feel for what style of design appeals to you. Native plants can fit into whatever aesthetic you prefer. Make a mental note as to where your aesthetics fall along this continuum. Different areas of your property may call for different approaches. The more rigid an HOA, the more formal the design requirements are likely to be. One simple concept of design stems from the savanna hypothesis, which suggests that our perception of beauty in the landscape is shaped by our human evolution. Our ancestors found safety in open, vegetated spaces with trees. So, we're instinctually attracted to a spacious landscape of small understory trees with an open canopy of see-through branches that separate near the ground into 2 or more trunks underplanted with low-growing plants. By choosing keystone trees, employing the savanna approach also adds appeal and ecological function, resulting in a design landscape that fits into any neighborhood. Through decades of studying how people interact with nature, researchers Kaplan, and Ryan identified 4 factors that we can apply to make our landscapes welcoming and appealing. A unifying ground layer is one way to give coherence to a landscape. This might be a matrix of native sedge or creeping plants, such as in the savanna-like planting at Mount Cuba in Delaware. Incorporating interesting features into your landscape helps to add visual complexity. Legibility describes an understandable and pleasing design through which visitors can easily navigate. Pathways and openings add mystery, enticing visitors with the promise that there's more to discover. As Joan Nassauer explained in a 1995 article, surrounding plantings with crisp, clean edges is a fast way to create an orderly frame that tidies up a native planting. Design your garden beds in pleasing shapes and maintain the quality of their edges. Straight lines should be straight, and smooth, curved edges, they should be graceful and kept smooth. Replacing lawn with natural plantings may upset our less receptive neighbors. We can make our landscape feel familiar and welcoming by adding signage, leaving a small patch of grass, providing seating, or planting familiar flowers. No space is too small to welcome biodiversity. The handy Thriller Filler Spiller recipe for container planting is also a helpful concept for designing attractive beds. Plan where a few taller accent plants can go, your thrillers, And these might be a tall perennial or clumping grass, a shrub or a tree. And then place your fillers, which can be several masses of 3 to 5 medium height flowering plants or grasses. Place logs and a water feature, and finish off by planting all the gaps with your spiller, such as native sedges or creeping plants like native strawberry. For more complex designs, dig in deeper with the free, downloadable native garden designs shared by Wild Ones. These are a super helpful resource that will help you incorporate professional design into your personal plantings. Visit wildones.org, click Programs, and click Native Garden Plans. Scroll down to choose a design. There isn't a design for Maryland, but the plans by Donald Pell for nearby Philadelphia are extensive, including such features as rain gardens. And the Washington, D.C. plans by Larry Weiner include plant mixes for a meadow and a woodland understory. All of the plans include plant lists and illustrated profiles of each plant. You can spend hours reading the tips and checking out the suggested plants on these plans and on plans from other cities as well. There's another important aspect of designing for people, accessibility. As we age, walking or getting up and down may become difficult or impossible. Consider proactively incorporating universal design. Universal design is a fascinating topic that unfortunately is beyond the scope of this talk, but the American Society of Landscape Architects explains the concepts of universal design and how to incorporate them in a garden by including features such as wide level paths, frequent seating, and much more. These principles can be applied to residential landscapes to help prepare our landscapes for gardening into our later years. My 96-year-old mother tends this garden in Southern California. In its own way, the garden tends her in return. Here are 3 books I particularly like about modifying gardens for people with mobility impairments and older adults. Now that we have a good idea how to choose plant species to plant and the importance of including planting and nesting sites, we need to procure lots of plants and get them in the ground. If you have the space, wildlife needs all the layers of the landscape. Next time you're out in your landscape, walk around and note where you might be able to add a layer of the landscape. Filling all the layers for a rich ecological landscape requires that we plant generously from ground to sky, but plants are expensive. Fortunately, many plants are easy to grow from seed, as easy as baking brownies. This allows you to save your plant budget for the difficult to propagate plants. For $4 for a packet of seed and several dollars for a seeding mix and some elbow grease, you can end up with lots of plants, more than you even have time to plant. Other propagation methods, such as growing plants from cuttings or division, are also super economical. Just keep in mind that whenever possible, growing plants from seed is the better choice to preserve genetic diversity. Speaking of genetic diversity, a common question is often asked: are cultivars okay to use in a natural landscape? Although some cultivars have good features, such as Phlox paniculata gina, a selection from the wild that attracts more pollinators than the straight species, most cultivars are propagated asexually, for example, by tissue culture, resulting in genetically identical twins, clones, as a matter of fact. In contrast, planting straight species from seed results in genetically unique plants. The lack of genetic diversity in a clonal population of plants fails to provide resilience in a changing environment and potentially threatens a species' survival. Changes in flower anatomy in cultivars may make nectar and pollen inaccessible to insects, as is the case for these poofy-headed coneflowers. Some flowers have ultraviolet nectar guides. We can't see them, but insects can. These patterns act like a map guiding insects to the nectar or pollen, and these maps may be scrambled or absent in cultivars. Another problem is that cultivars may cross-pollinate with wild populations of the straight species and contaminate the genetic pool of the wild population. This happens with rose mallow. The red foliage bred into cultivars is now showing up in rose mallow populations in the wild, and studies show that red foliage is significantly inferior as a caterpillar host plant. In some cases, cultivars are your only choice to purchase. Some cultivars, such as the American chestnut, offer resistance to diseases that threaten straight species. And cultivars with their compact growth, for example, can play a role in building acceptance for a more natural look. It's just that when it comes to supporting genetic diversity for a resilient landscape filled with life, it's best to stick with straight species grown from seed whenever possible. In the handout, I've included these 3 pages from Nature's Action Guide with tips for procuring plants on a tight budget to make it easier to plant generously. I've also included these 2 pages in the handout to show how to make these upcycled pots for growing plugs and long-lasting plant labels to help us move toward zero waste. I highly recommend this video to learn more about growing specific species of native plants from the Mid-Atlantic region from seed. With our landscapes designed to please and our plants in place, all that's left now is to care for our property in a wildlife-friendly way that adds to its appeal. In addition to design, how we care for our landscape determines how people will respond to it. Cues to care, another concept introduced by Joan Nassauer, are visible actions that can help our landscapes gain acceptance wherever we live. A tidy mailbox area and a welcoming entrance help build acceptance, as does a clean and tidy exterior. Reducing lawn, if you have any lawn, is an important action to support biodiversity, but leaving a little bit of lawn and mowing it shows your neighbors that you're actively maintaining your landscape, and it allows you to have your surrounding landscape be a little more natural. Keeping sidewalks tidy and clear is an important cue to care, though sometimes it's simply not possible. With some thought toward design and regular upkeep, our landscapes can be filled with birds and butterflies, and they can inspire others to embrace a more natural look. But sometimes, even a slightly more natural approach can run against a restrictive HOA. If that's the case where you live, become informed, get to know the exact HOA policies, and be intentional about your designs. Learn more about how to work with an HOA by visiting Homegrown National Park. They provide steps for proactively building positive relationships with HOAs. If you receive a citation, check out the detailed guidelines by Wild Ones. They host an informative video, What to Do When the Weed Police Knock on Your Door. Staying calm, persistent, and positive helps bring about an agreeable outcome. Take time to enjoy your wildlife landscape. Your presence in the garden is one of the best ways to encourage neighborhood acceptance, and your shadow is the best guarantee that your wildlife habitat will both thrive and be beautiful. Sharing our wildlife habitat experiences and skills with others is one of the best ways to expand wildlife habitat. If you're fortunate to have the opportunity to share your wildlife habitat with children, giving children experiences with nature builds lasting connections, often leading to a lifetime of caring about the natural world. In the handout, I've listed these 3 books that are filled with ideas for instilling a love of nature in children. Emotional connections with the wildlife around us, such as a bird with a broken leg that we begin to recognize and keep an eye out for, can motivate us to persist in taking the actions that matter. So was the case with P22, a beloved puma living in Southern California. P22 defied the odds by traveling from his birthplace through populated areas and crossing 2 10-lane freeways to make his home in Griffith Park, where he lived most of his life in just the 9 square miles of the park. First spotted in 2012, P22 rose to fame, becoming the poster puma for a wildlife crossing over the 101 freeway. Tragically, in late 2022, after being hit by a car, he was euthanized. The public sentiment around P22's life and death was instrumental in generating $87 million in donations for the Wallace-Annenberg Wildlife Crossing, currently under construction and expected to be completed this fall. P22 gave people a connection to nature that stirred them to caring action. All around us are the reminders of the effect our human activities have upon wildlife, giving us all the more reason to do whatever we can to support biodiversity and our local ecosystems. This chart in the handout sums up the steps for creating a biodiverse wildlife habitat and paints a picture of a wildlife landscape filled with life. In spaces large and small, your wildlife habitat will make a difference. Whether you're just starting out or leagues beyond, as we work together to create resilient wildlife habitat that helps to address both biodiversity loss and climate instability, I'm so glad to be on this journey with you. Thank you so much. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. And I promise to put the link up for the handout. And that is the link. Yeah. Does anyone have any questions? Hi.
Oh, there. Thank you for your presentation.
Oh,
It
you're
was
very
very informative. I know that you're supposed to leave dead logs and things like that in your yard.
Yes.
But just today I was looking at a Christmas tree I have in my yard that's beyond dead. Is it best to just start over with a new tree the next year? Does it matter that it's disintegrating, or is that favorable?
It's favorable. It's
Okay,
a
so
wonderful
leave
thing.
it.
And,
Okay.
you know, another thing that Doug and Cindy telling me, I was feeding Doug's birds when he was gone over the winter in the snow. And what he did was he left an old Christmas tree and he put the bird seed in it, because then they were safe while they were eating the bird seed from the hawks. So that's another use of a Christmas tree. But definitely the dead wood, the longer it's there, the more it's disintegrating and decaying. You're supporting all sorts of beetles and insects. And
Well, I have plenty
bees.
of that then.
Oh, good. Yeah, dead wood.
Hi, thank you so much.
Very
I have a lot of poison ivy in my yard, and I would not like to use pesticide, but I feel like I'm pretty much, hemmed in that way. Can you have any recommendations about what to do about poison ivy?
Well, the first thing to remember or to know is that poison ivy is a super beneficial native plant, unfortunately, and it's really rich berries. It's a wonderful plant. I, too, am very allergic to it. So what I do is I put my hand in a plastic bag, and then I put another plastic bag. One's, reuse, like recycled. I don't purchase them, obviously. And then I put another one over. When it's a small, I'd get it when it's small, and then I reach down like this, and then I really carefully pull the other bag over, and I don't get poison ivy on me. It's a plastic heavy thing. That's the one downside. And catch it when it's small. The other thing is you can loosen up the soil ahead of time, shovel underneath it carefully.
Okay.
And then, but are your plants really big growing up trees?
No.
Oh, if they were, then you can also girdle the stem at the base, and that then will kill it as well.
Okay.
Yeah, does that help? Do you see how that works?
Well, it's so prolific. I mean, it has spread in several places, and I've tried to pull out the young plants, but I couldn't get them to come straight out of the soil.
Because they have a pretty good root.
Yeah.
So if you do have a young plant, loosen the soil first before trying to pull it.
Okay.
And then get ready to pull it with a lot of force.
Okay.
And then if you have a patch that's just too much, to use the plastic bag method.
Yeah.
And I do, in Nature's Action Guide, I do go through the 4 steps. It might explain it better. The other thing you could do is, if you could, smother it with cardboard. So if it's a patch, smother it with cardboard, but then keep fully aware that underneath there is poison ivy
Yeah.
remnants, because that will also still have the oil that could give you a rash. But over time, then you could use that, replant that area. So I would
Okay.
smother it as well. If you can leave it, in any place you can leave it, but sometimes it has to go.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Can native plants overwhelm the poison ivy?
No, well, and poison ivy is a very good native plant, but no, there's not really a plant that will. Virginia creeper will compete with it, so that also is a vine that will help to make it less dominant. But are you familiar with Virginia creeper?
I've heard of it, yeah.
Yeah, it's the one that has, it looks a lot like poison ivy when it's young, but it has five blades of, it's 5 pinnate, yeah,
Okay.
5 portions to its leaf.
Thank you.
Yeah.
At the risk of this turning into a conversation about poison ivy, I have noticed in the big woods in Pinecrest that it seems that, and maybe this needs to be confirmed, that all those little plants, they're just hoping for one winter to find a tree, and that once it finds a tree, it puts all of its energy in that area into making a great big vine on the tree, which is producing berries up there, but not causing any problem for you walking around. So if you don't have any big trees around, that could be part of what's going on.
Oh, interesting.
So it's the plant itself is foraging.
Yeah, it's looking for a tree, yeah.
Interesting. And the birds are helping distribute. Yeah.
Question about, since we're doing specific pest sort of plants, there are a few variations of mulberry trees, and my understanding is, there's some that have been around all along, and they're, kind of not that big, and they just sort of get along. Then there's another variety that are not native, and that they are also super irritating. And I can attest to that. So, do you have anything to say about mulberry trees and the things that you like and don't about them?
Yeah, I do have thoughts on mulberry trees. Now, when you say irritating, you are meaning that they're a weedy problem, not skin irritation.
Yeah, it's just making your living space
Filled with
inhabitable. You
Lots of-
can't have an inch, covering your patio, and expect to go outside in the backyard.
Oh,
there's
okay,
just
the
no
fruit.
way.
Yes, the
So
fruit.
the tree has to go. Like, I don't know why it was planted right next to the patio, and it's it's worse than a willow or a tree of heaven trying to claw its way back once it gets attacked. But that's my perspective. Is this thing's just not a friendly thing with things around it, including
Yeah.
us.
Well, it's really interesting because the native mulberry, is the native mulberry, which has little tinier, smaller fruit that isn't as tasty, unfortunately. And then the cultivated mulberries are they're introduced species, they're hybridized. But what has happened is that these introduced species have mixed with the native species, so the native species is no longer pure, much like I was talking about with cultivars. So, but here's the interesting thing. As far as mulberry trees are concerned, they don't really host that many caterpillars. So I talked to Doug about this, and he said that because they don't really host that many caterpillars, it doesn't really matter in this case whether you plant a native or a non-native mulberry. This doesn't quite answer your concern, but that is good to know about mulberries, is that if you want a fruiting mulberry that's not next to your patio, then that it doesn't matter that it is actually a cultivated one. And now, as far as if I were in your situation, I think that I would be inclined to replace that tree with a tree that does give you greater shade pleasure without being dropped with mulberries. Are the mulberries tasty? I mean, are they little, small, or are they white, or are they purple, dark purple?
Yeah, they're dark, and
That's-
I think that's subjective. I don't think they're any good, but I guess some people do.
Well, are they, what size are they? Are they about like 1/2 inch or 2 inches long?
They're in clusters. Probably the size of a blueberry.
So what he has is a native blueberry, a native mulberry, more of a native mulberry. So that native mulberry, yeah, it's not going to taste as good, and it will. The other challenging thing about mulberries is the birds eat them, and they're very hard to pull. Does anyone try to pull out a mulberry? And once you have a little one growing, it's also very hard to kill because it keeps coming up from. Yeah. So what I would recommend is if you want to replace that tree. It sounds like you should for your own happiness. And but it will want to sprout. So without using herbicides, what you can do is cut it off at the base and then put some landscape fabric, tie that with twine, and leave, if it's a place where you can do this, and leave that for probably a couple years. It might take. Every time you see some new shoots coming off, then trim them off. And eventually it will give up its energy. But it will continue to try to grow. They want to grow. But yeah.
Since you just mentioned something, let me flip around from questions to statement. So, frustratingly, I just verified that basic landscaping roll fabric. It's not really fabric. It's petroleum based. So
Yes.
avoid it.
Avoid it at all costs, except
But
if you
maybe
happen
there's
to
a-
have some.
Yeah, if you have any suggestions, also when you use a lot of times people have tarps to get mulch in their pickup truck or whatever. That's just going to be microplastics flaking off over time in the UV. So that's kind of bad too. So we started using canvas. Tarps instead. But if there's a good, non-petroleum landscape, mat that anybody knows of, that would be great to hear about.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the concept about covering up? Is it to starve
Oh, yeah, the stump.
Is it just covering the stump?
Yeah, and
What's the concept behind
it's just you're basically smothering its suckers that are going to really want to come up. And when you cut even a little small mulberry tree and you cut it here, you're going to get all sorts of growth along here. So if you cover it, I pulled up all the landscape fabric that I inherited when we purchased this property. So I have that I wrap it with. But to your point, I'm really glad you mentioned that, because landscape fabric's got to go. It's really, not only is it putting out PFAs and other microplastic stuff, but it prevents the caterpillar and the interaction between the soil and all the microorganisms and macroorganisms that need to navigate between the soil and the duff, the leaves and such. So thank you for mentioning that. Yeah, but in terms of using something to smother, it's smothering the growth. As opposed, a lot of people recommend painting herbicides on it, on the trunk. And I personally ascribe to no herbicides, but I believe we can do this on our own properties. I've been able to do it so far, but I do constantly have lots of things I'm always removing too. So, it's a trade-off there. But you can also brush, herbicide on that. But as an alternative, smothering it works.
So
Yeah.
burlap? I'm sorry.
Burlap,
Sorry about that. Would burlap to continue that thought? Would that be something adequate to?
the question is about burlap. Yeah.
Right, so I'm asking if burlap would be adequate to smother the stump, or several layers of burlap
It would have to
tightly
be several layers, yes.
secured.
And you might even put some kind of, maybe some, if you really want to avoid all plastics, you might not put some old plastic, food grade, things that food came in. Perhaps you could, something to truly smother it. It might poke through the burlap. It wants, mulberry might. Others would be less persistent. Yeah. You can even use, old T-shirts. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, you could use a bucket, but you would need to seal it to the ground because it wants to come. The question was whether you could use a bucket, but you need to seal it to the ground because it'll send up shoots from the ground crown layer. Yeah.
Use the canvas tarp. This is just another plug for canvas tarps. They're very useful. And there's no, from what I've seen the studies out, there's no food grade plastic. Like if you put plastic in your dishwasher, if you use it in a microwave, you're just ingesting microplastics.
Yeah. And that is a big concern. Is the canvas readily available at in most stores that sell tarps? Do they also sell canvas tarps?
No, that's the challenge of it. You gotta look a little harder.
Okay. Yeah. Yes.
As I'm transitioning into trying to plant more native plants on my property, and I had like all kinds of chinaberry dug out, and I had mud, and so I got some wildflower seeds and threw those out, and that turned out to be a problem because wildflower seeds are not necessarily what they claim to be. And the issue of hybrids and of what's best for your area and all those kinds of things, I find the most sort of confusing, baffling area. One of the things that was in that wildflower mix were lupins. And so I tried to find out what is the correct, they're great, but what is the correct lupin to grow here? And it's sundial lupins. And it has to be non-hybridized sundial lupins. And people who sell the seeds are not always clear, and the species name is not necessarily clear from the western variety to the eastern variety that have become hybridized. Yes. And fortunately, through online and contact with some folks, I was able to find that Prairie Moon does testing, and they have absolutely the right sundial lupin to grow here. So I was planting those today, some sundial lupins. But that is just, that's a struggle. You know, I've got, college degrees and I can do research, but for just most people, this could just be such a barrier to trying to find what is a native plant and what is the right native plant for your area. And I wonder about resources and places to find better information and clear up the stuff that's hard to plow through.
Well, now you know exactly why I wrote to Dr. Talamy 5 years ago and said, hey, because I too had years and years of gardening experience, farming experience, and I was challenged. I still think there are still challenges, a lot of work, but that is what I put together was how do you identify the Bonap maps? That's a key to figuring out which species, because you could go to the species and see all different ones, and you see whether it's in your county or not. And then the national, the native plant finders, different tools, those tools really helpful. And then once you sort of break that code, you understand which are the keystone plants and the pollinator plants, and the tree, recognizing that trees are really important as well. Then you use the Bonap maps, you start to be pretty empowered, and you can go to the nursery. The only thing you start to become frustrated by is the lack of availability. And that's where growing from seed expands your horizons immensely. It takes some doing, and sometimes you have good years. Like this year, I'm having a terrible year with my seeds, but last year I had a great year. So sometimes, that different things work out perfectly, or your timing does, and sometimes they don't. But it's not a big investment. In fact, in my case, I'm now collecting seeds from all the plants I'm growing. So it's really just an investment of time, and enough, works out that I have plenty to plant, So experimenting and just keeping doing it, and you'll get familiar with it. Yeah. And use the tools. Use the Wild Ones native plant garden designs, because they've already figured out combinations of plants, and the resources now go to the Native Plant Society. Maryland Native Plant Society is active and really great. And they have all the different resources of where you can buy plants and locally. So, yeah, but I totally relate to that. It's a challenge. And that is exactly what Doug and I sat down at my dining room table figuring out, what do we need? How do we reach everybody? I mean, we're here because we're interested in it, but how do we reach the average homeowner who's busy with life and doesn't even care? It's a big task. Yeah.
I had a quick question about mycorrhizal networks. Like you
Yeah.
talked about the 6 layers, and that root layer in the last few years, it's become really fascinating to a lot of people, and the way the mycorrhizal mushroom networks like provide greater resilience, like in forests and everything. And I wondered if you or Doug have learned anything about in places where the mycorrhizal network was damaged, say during like suburban development and years of grass and everything. Are there things that people do to kind of inoculate and reestablish things in the soil, like by taking from a rich woodland like a little bit of soil and moving it into their yard?
Yeah, that is one strategy. Also, wood chips help, and keeping, when it's possible, moist leaf litter and duff and wood chips, that starts to build up that microorganisms world. So yeah, keep doing that, and inoculate it like that is a good idea, bringing soil in. A stack of old logs over time becomes a really rich place. Over 5 or 6 years, you'll have just this very rich, you can see when you look under a microscope, you can see that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, just, I guess, a negative observation, a question, and a couple of positives. On the negative side, lesser celandine. We have, in this area, just so much of it, and the
Yeah.
only thing that's being recommended by this city is the herbicide that's used, because glyphosate. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that. On the positive side, there are local organizations here in Tacoma Park area, climateactioncoffee.org. So if you want to join with other folks doing things with pollinators or food forest, etc. And also there is Native Plants DMV, which talks about where plant swaps are, and this weekend there's some in the area. So Native Plants DMV and Climate Action Coffee. But what are your thoughts on lesser celandine?
Well, it's a real big problem, and glyphosate's also a big problem, despite what Bayer and Monsanto want us to believe. So, and the other problem with herbicides and lesser celandine is that it's often grows near aquatic. I mean, it likes moisture, so it's risking the aquatic environment as well. What I would recommend is checking with the Maryland Native Plant Society, because they have a very active invasive plant council, not council per se, but active. They're very active, and they're constantly lobbying for things. It seems like you're familiar. Yeah. So that would be my go-to source for that. It's just, and then start to address it. Yeah, Cindy and I walk along an area where there's a lot of that, and we were planning to go and tackle it, but it's almost useless to try, because it has little, not rhizomes, but little underground storage.
Yeah, it's
What are
almost
they?
impossible.
I think they are nodules. Yeah, I'm not positive of the botanical term, but if you have even one little speck of it in your yard, dig it out immediately, but dig out every part of the root and dispose of it, like completely, not in the compost. Yeah. Oh, terrible. Yes.
Have you tried other ways for deer? And specifically, I'd rather put a scarecrow or like a coyote, silhouette or something like that than have to mess around with the fencing and whatnot.
Yeah. I do. I use a sprinkler, and also I do fence half the yard so that I have some area where I can just put anything without worrying about it. And then in the rest, I plant. I have now just sticking to plants that they eat far less often, and so there's a lot. There's a lot. Of course, all the mints are really great that way. So a lot of the sunflowers, and well, a lot of the grasses as well, and then there's some shrubs that do, so, and Pacra aurea. And so there's a lot, and I just really rely on them, on those plants. And I do list some other strategies. I've pretty much tried them all, but at some point I just, kind of like, oh, I'm just gonna plant plants that deer are resistant to,
Well, we some of what we plant is like food, so
Oh yeah.
that's not gonna. I mean, we got mountain mint and stuff, but
Yep.
I don't know about you, but we've got our deer are on steroids. I mean, those things are the size of mule deer, so they could jump over. Could almost jump over the moon. So I don't know how fences stop them unless there's like a roof to it. But
And a double fence. Yeah, that's what I use
maybe
too.
maybe
Yeah.
a palisade with spikes. But the food forest at Montgomery College is like a pretty good case to consider. Like, oh wow, because that's bigger than most people's yards, and it starts to make you think like, all right, well, what kind of measures could be applied here?
Would you consider something like the sheep fat, even though it's an animal product? That's a downside of it. But
Well, I mean,
'cause that-
sheep are going to die all the time, just like everything. So,
yeah,
I mean, be good to go look at the pedigree of how they get it. But I'm sure that if that is used more, the price will come down. So it could
Yeah.
be great.
plus it's extremely effective. The people I've talked to that've used it really, really swear by it. The deer sprinkler works quite well for me as well, but that's I think would not work for what you're describing. Yeah, it's a problem that truly needs to be dealt with on a larger community basis, and the means of dealing with it are not all, they're controversial. So yeah. Yeah, venison yeah.
Any other questions?
Yes, we do. Our predators are out of balance. Our prey and predators. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for
Oh,
coming.
you're very
Great presentation.
welcome. Thank you.
Really enjoyed it. And she has books for sale up here if anybody wants any. A lot of information in the book there, so feel free to come up here and buy a book.
This-
Specific, you referenced a handout.
Yes. Yes, it's naturesactionguide.org/biodiversity. Yeah, and has all the references I listed.